A millionaire man once mocked an orphaned girl for asking him for help. 6 years later, he would crumble before everyone when he found out who adopted her. It was a bustling day in the financial district. Between the skyscrapers of glass and steel, a small figure moved with determination. Her name was Elena, a 12-year-old girl with tangled hair and worn clothes. Her eyes were fixed on the most imposing building on the avenue. "Today is the day," she murmured to herself, clutching a wrinkled envelope to her chest. "It has to work." When she reached the building's entrance, a security guard looked at her suspiciously. "What are you doing here, little girl?" "This is no place for beggars." Elena raised her chin defiantly. "I'm not a beggar. I'm here to see Mr. Goldstein." The guard let out a laugh. "You see Mr. Goldstein? Not even executives can see him without an appointment." "Please," Elena insisted. "It's important. I have something for him." "Listen, kid," the guard growled, losing his patience. "Get out of here before I call the police." Elena backed away but did not give up. She sat on the steps of the entrance, determined to wait. Hours passed and the sun began to set. Employees left in droves, completely ignoring her. As night began to fall, the doors swung open and a group of men in suits came out, laughing. In their midst was Hector Goldstein, the most powerful tycoon in the city. Elena jumped to her feet. "Mr. Goldstein!" Hector stopped, frowning. "What the hell?" "Mr. Goldstein," Elena repeated, approaching him. "Please, I need to talk to you." One of Hector's companions stepped forward. "Come on, kid. Mr. Goldstein doesn't have time for this." "It's just for a moment," Elena pleaded. Hector sighed in annoyance. "Fine. You have 30 seconds. The clock is ticking." Elena took a deep breath and began to speak in a rush. "Mr. Goldstein, I come from the St. Mary's Orphanage. We need urgent help. The roof is falling apart. We don't have heating, and many children are sick. If you could donate something, anything." Hector cut her off with a laugh. "Donate? Me? Little girl, do you have any idea how many people ask me for money every day?" "But sir, it's for the children. They're suffering," Elena blurted. "And they will continue to suffer," Hector retorted. "That's life. The strong survive, the weak perish. It's the law of nature." Tears stung Elena's eyes, but she stood her ground. "Please, Mr. Goldstein, even a small donation could—" "Enough!" Hector roared. He turned to his companions. "See what happens when you give them an inch? They want to take a mile." The men laughed, and a desperate Elena pulled the wrinkled envelope from her pocket. "At least you could read this letter. All the children at the orphanage wrote it." Hector looked at the envelope with contempt. "Read it?" "Of course. Let me see." He extended his hand, and for a moment, Elena's heart filled with hope. But then, with a cruel smile, Hector took the envelope and ripped it to shreds in front of her. "There's your answer, kid." The pieces of paper fell like snowflakes around Elena. The tears she had been holding back finally overflowed. "How can you be so cruel?" she sobbed. Hector leaned down, his face inches from Elena's. "Listen to me, little girl. The world is cruel. The sooner you learn that, the better off you'll be. Now get out of my sight." But Elena didn't move. She stood there trembling with anger and sadness. Irritated by her persistence, Hector took out his wallet. "You want money? Fine, I'll give you money." He pulled out a wad of bills and tossed them into the air. The bills fluttered around Elena, some landing in puddles, others being carried away by the wind. "Go on, pick them up," Hector shouted. "Show me how much you want it." Paralyzed by humiliation, Elena didn't move. Hector and his companions burst into laughter. "Look at her," Hector scoffed. "She doesn't even know how to take money when it's offered to her. No wonder they are where they are." At that moment, a voice interrupted the scene. "What's going on here?" An elegant woman approached, her face a mask of concern. It was Margaret, Hector's wife. "Nothing, darling," Hector replied, his tone instantly changing. "Just teaching this little scammer a lesson." Margaret looked at Elena, who was still crying silently. "Hector, what have you done?" "What needed to be done?" he replied, irritated. "Let's go." But Margaret didn't budge. She walked up to Elena and knelt beside her. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" Elena shook her head, unable to speak. "Margaret, please," Hector insisted. "We have reservations." "Go on without me," Margaret replied, her eyes still on Elena. "I'll be along in a moment." Hector snorted in annoyance. Fine, but don't be long. As Hector and his companions walked away, Margaret took out a handkerchief and began to dry Elena's tears. What's your name, sweetheart? Elena, the girl replied between sobs. Elena, I'm so sorry for what happened. My husband, he's not always like this. Elena looked at her incredulously. Why is he so mean? Margaret sighed. It's complicated, Elena. Sometimes people with a lot of power forget what it's like not to have it. But I just wanted help for the orphanage, Elena explained. The children are sick, and the building is falling apart. Margaret's face softened. Which orphanage are you talking about? St. Maris, Elena replied. It's on the east side of town. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Listen, Elena, I can't undo what happened today, but I promise I'll do something about it. Okay? Elena looked at her hopefully. Really? Really, Margaret affirmed. She pulled a card from her purse and handed it to Elena. If you ever need anything at all, call me, day or night. Elena took the card with trembling hands. Thank you, Mrs. Margaret stood up and looked around at the bills Hector had thrown. Take these, she said, handing them to Elena. Use them for the orphanage. And remember, not everyone is like Hector. With a final hug, Margaret said goodbye and walked away in the same direction as Hector. Elena was left standing there, holding the money and the card, unsure what to think. As she walked back to the orphanage, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Hector's cruelty, Margaret's kindness. It all swirled in her mind. When she reached the orphanage, Sister Maria was waiting for her at the door, her face a mixture of worry and relief. Elena, where have you been? We were so worried. Elena ran to her and hugged her, bursting into tears again. Between sobs, she told her everything that had happened. Sister Maria listened silently, stroking her hair. When Elena was finished, the nun sighed deeply. Oh, my child, I'm so sorry. You shouldn't have had to go through that. Elena looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Why, sister? Why are some people so cruel? Sister Maria led her to a nearby bench, and they sat down together. Elena, in this world, there are all kinds of people. Some, like that Mr. Goldstein, have forgotten what compassion is. But remember, there are also people like that kind lady who helped you. But he has so much money, Elena insisted. He could help so many children. Money, Elena, doesn't always make people better. Sometimes it even makes them forget where they came from and what's truly important in life. Elena took out the bills Margaret had given her. The lady gave me this for the orphanage. Sister Maria looked at them in surprise. Elena, this is a lot of money. We'll be able to fix the roof? Elena asked hopefully, and the nun smiled sadly. It will help, no doubt, but I'm afraid we need much more than this. At that moment, a commotion was heard from inside the orphanage. Screams and cries echoed through the halls. What is it? Elena asked, alarmed. Sister Maria jumped to her feet. Oh no, it must be Tommy. His fever has been getting worse. They both ran inside. In one of the rooms, several children surrounded a bed where Tommy lay, an 8-year-old boy sweating and trembling. Step aside, children, Sister Maria ordered. She went to Tommy and put a hand on his forehead. He's burning up. Elena, bring cold water and cloths, quick. Elena ran to get what was asked for. As she soaked the cloths, she couldn't stop thinking about Hector Goldstein and how his help could have prevented this. Hours passed as they tended to Tommy. His fever rose and fell, and in his moments of lucidity, the boy cried out in pain. Sister, Elena whispered at one point, what if I call the lady, Mr. Goldstein's wife? She gave me her card. Sister Maria hesitated. I don't know, Elena. We can't be bothering those people at this hour. But she said I could call any time, Elena insisted. Please, sister, for Tommy. After a moment of reflection, the nun relented. All right, try it. With trembling hands, Elena dialed the number on the card. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Just as she was about to hang up, a sleepy voice answered. Hello? Mrs. Goldstein? Elena asked nervously. Who is this? The voice replied, now more alert. It's Elena, the girl from the orphanage. I'm so sorry to call so late, but… Elena, Margaret interrupted, her voice filled with concern. What's wrong? Elena quickly explained Tommy's situation. Margaret listened silently and then said, "Give me the address of the orphanage. I'll be there in 20 minutes." Before Elena could reply, Margaret had hung up. The next few minutes were an eternity. Sister Maria continued to tend to Tommy while Elena waited anxiously at the door. Finally, a luxurious car pulled up in front of the orphanage. Margaret Goldstein stepped out, followed by a man Elena recognized as Hector's chauffeur. "Where's the boy?" Margaret asked without preamble. Elena quickly led her to the room. Upon seeing Tommy's condition, Margaret turned to her driver. "James, call Dr. Clydeson. Tell him it's an emergency and to come immediately." The man nodded and hurried out. Margaret approached Tommy and began to examine him carefully. "Are you a doctor?" Sister Maria asked in surprise. Margaret shook her head. "No, but I've worked in hospitals as a volunteer. This boy needs urgent care." Over the next hour, the scene was a whirlwind of activity. Margaret, true to her word, ensured Tommy received the best care, a stark contrast to her husband's callous indifference. Little did Hector know, the girl he dismissed so easily would become a constant reminder of the compassion he lacked, all thanks to the woman who chose kindness over cruelty. The events of that day were a powerful lesson for Elena, showing her that even in a world where some choose to be like Hector, there will always be those like Margaret, proving that goodness, like a small act of defiance, can bloom even in the harshest conditions. The doctor arrived, examined Tommy, and diagnosed him with a severe infection. With Margaret's authorization, the boy was transferred to a private hospital. When calm finally returned to the orphanage, Margaret sat down with Elena and Sister Maria. "This can't go on like this," she said, her voice full of determination. "This place needs urgent help." "We've tried everything," Sister Maria replied tiredly. "But nobody seems to listen." Margaret took their hands. "Well, I'm listening, and I promise I'll do everything in my power to help." Elena looked at her with hopeful eyes. "Really? Really?" Margaret affirmed. "Tomorrow morning, I'll start moving heaven and earth to get funds and support. This orphanage will have the help it needs." Tears welled up in Sister Maria's eyes as she hugged Margaret. "God bless you, Mrs. Goldstein." As dawn peeked through the windows of the orphanage, Elena felt that despite everything that had happened, maybe, just maybe, things would start to get better. What none of them knew was that this night would change their lives forever. The next morning, Elena woke to the sound of agitated voices in the hallway. She rubbed her eyes and stepped out of the room she shared with 5 other girls. "What's going on?" she asked one of the older boys who ran past. "It's Mr. Goldstein," the boy exclaimed. "He's here!" Elena's heart skipped a beat. "Hector Goldstein? At the orphanage?" She ran towards the main entrance, where a group of children and staff had gathered. There, in the middle of the shabby lobby, stood Hector Goldstein. His impeccable designer suit contrasted sharply with the peeling walls. Beside him, Margaret watched with a mixture of surprise and caution. "Hector," Margaret said, "I wasn't expecting to see you here." Hector cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Well, dear, when I didn't find you at home this morning and they told me where you were, I was curious." His eyes scanned the place, stopping at the cracks in the ceiling and the damp patches on the walls. His expression was unreadable. Elena stepped forward, gathering all her courage. "Mr. Goldstein." Hector's eyes fell on her, recognizing her instantly. For a moment it seemed as if he were about to say something unpleasant, but he stopped himself. "You're the girl from last night." Elena nodded. "Yes, sir." "Hector," Margaret interjected, "this is Elena, the girl I told you about." Hector frowned. "Margaret, what exactly are you doing here?" Before Margaret could answer, Sister Maria appeared. "Mr. and Mrs. Goldstein, what a surprise. Can I offer you some tea?" Hector opened his mouth to decline, but Margaret spoke first. "That would be lovely, sister, and perhaps we could speak privately afterwards." Minutes later, the Goldsteins, Sister Maria, and Elena were seated in the nun's small office. The contrast between the luxury the Goldsteins were accustomed to and the austerity of the place was palpable. "Hector," Margaret began, "last night, after what happened, Elena called me. One of the children, Tommy, was seriously ill. I had to intervene." Hector shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Margaret, I understand that you want to help, But we can't. No, Hector, Margaret cut him off firmly. You don't understand. This place is on the verge of collapse. These children need urgent help. Hector looked around, his expression a mix of displeasure and something that might have been guilt. And what do you expect me to do? We can't save all the orphans in the world. Elena, who had been silent until now, spoke. We're not asking you to save the world, Mr. Goldstein. Just us. Hector stared at her, and for a fleeting moment, Elena saw something in his eyes. Recognition, remorse. Sister Maria intervened. Mr. Goldstein, I know there was a misunderstanding last night with Elena, but I assure you we are not looking for charity. These children just need a chance. Hector abruptly stood up and walked to the window. From there he could see the orphanage's courtyard, where a few children were playing with a deflated ball. You know, he finally said without turning around, I grew up in a place like this. The silence that followed his statement was deafening. Margaret was staring at him, her eyes wide, clearly surprised by this revelation. Hector, she whispered, you never told me. He turned, his face a mask of contained emotions. It's not something I'm proud of, Margaret. I spent years trying to forget it, to leave that part of my life behind. Elena approached him, her small hand hesitantly touching his. But you made it, Mr. Goldstein. You got out. Hector looked down at Elena's hand, and for the first time since he had arrived, a shadow of a smile crossed his face. Yes, I did. But I forgot where I came from. I forgot what it's like to have nothing. He turned to Sister Maria. Sister, how much would it cost to completely renovate this place? The nun blinked, taken aback by his sudden change. I'm not sure. Several million, I suppose. Hector nodded. Right. I'll make a donation of 10 million. And not only that, I want to set up a foundation to help orphanages all over the city. Margaret walked over to her husband and took his hand. Hector, that's wonderful. He looked at her, and for a moment he seemed vulnerable. I should have listened to you sooner, Margaret. I should have listened to Elena. He turned to the girl. Elena, I owe you an apology. Last night, I wasn't the best version of myself. Elena smiled, tears of joy welling up in her eyes. It's okay, Mr. Goldstein. The important thing is that you are here now. Sister Maria, also teary-eyed, approached him. Mr. Goldstein, I don't know how to thank you. Hector raised a hand. Don't thank me, sister. Consider it a debt I owed the universe. At that moment, a commotion was heard outside. The door burst open, and there stood Tommy, the boy who had been hospitalized the night before, running into the room. Elena, he shouted, I'm better. The doctor said I can come back. He stopped short when he saw the adults. Oh, I'm sorry, he said, blushing. Hector knelt down in front of Tommy. So you're Tommy. I'm glad you're feeling better. Tommy looked at him curiously. Who are you, mister? Hector smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face. I'm someone who's going to make sure that you and all the children here have a bright future. As Tommy hugged Elena, celebrating his return, Hector stood and looked around. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. Margaret, he said, turning to his wife, I think we have a lot of work to do. Margaret smiled and nodded. Yes, dear. And I think this is just the beginning. As the Goldsteins began discussing plans with Sister Maria, Elena watched the scene with a mix of astonishment and gratitude. In less than 24 hours, her world had turned upside down. And although she knew that there was still a lot to be done, for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. What Elena didn't know was that this was only the beginning of a series of events that would change not only her life, but the lives of many others. The journey that had started with a desperate plea on the street would turn into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. Meanwhile, outside the orphanage, news of the Goldsteins' visit was beginning to spread. Reporters were starting to gather, curious to know what the infamous tycoon was doing in such an unexpected place. The world was about to see a new side of Hector Goldstein, and no one was prepared for what would come next. The bell at San Ignacio School rang through the halls, signaling the end of another school day. Among the tide of students flooding the corridors, 18-year-old Elena made her way with determination. Elena, wait! A familiar voice called from behind her. Elena stopped and turned to see her best friend Sophia hurrying to catch up. "What's up, Sophie?" Elena asked, adjusting the strap of her backpack. Sophia, out of breath, handed her an envelope. "Almost forgot. This came for you at the main office." Elena looked at the envelope curiously. The Columbia University logo stood out in the top corner. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly. Sophia was looking at her expectantly. "Well, are you going to open it or what?" Elena took a deep breath. "Not here. Let's go to the park." As they walked toward the nearby park, Sophia chattered excitedly. "Can you imagine, Elena? Columbia, you could be a hop, skip, and a jump away from New York City." "New York?" Elena laughed nervously. "Sophie, I don't even know if I got in yet." "Oh, come on," Sophia replied, rolling her eyes. "You're the best in our class. Of course you got in." Reaching the park, they settled on a bench. Elena stared at the envelope for what seemed like an eternity. "Just open it already," Sophia exclaimed impatiently. With trembling fingers, Elena tore open the envelope and pulled out the letter. Her eyes scanned the lines quickly. "Well?" Sophia pressed. Elena looked up, a smile lighting up her face. "I got in." Sophia shrieked with delight and threw her arms around her friend. "I knew it! I knew it!" As Sophia danced around in excitement, Elena remained seated, looking at the letter with a mixture of happiness and worry. "Elena," Sophia said, noticing her friend's expression, "what's wrong? You should be jumping for joy." Elena sighed. "It's just, New York is so far away. The orphanage, the kids, Sister Maria." Sophia sat down next to her. "Hey, I get it. It's a big decision, but this is your chance. You've worked so hard for this." "I know," Elena replied. "It's just what?" "It's a big change." Sophia took her friend's hand. "Big changes are scary, but they also bring big opportunities." At that moment, Elena's phone buzzed. It was a text from Margaret Goldstein. "It's Mrs. Goldstein," Elena said. "She wants me to come over to their house this afternoon." Sophia smiled. "Perfect. You can tell her the news in person." Hours later, Elena stood before the Goldsteins' imposing mansion. Even though she'd been there countless times over the past 6 years, she was still intimidated by its grandeur. But this visit held a weight different from the others. It carried the weight of her future, a future intertwined with the choices she was about to make. Before Elena could ring the doorbell, the door swung open, revealing James, the butler. "Miss Elena," he greeted with a smile. "Mrs. Goldstein is expecting you in the garden." Elena followed James through the luxurious house until they reached the back garden. There, Margaret Goldstein sat at an elegant wrought iron table surrounded by blooming roses. "Elena, dear," Margaret exclaimed, rising to embrace her. "Come, sit down. James, please bring us some tea." Once they were seated, Margaret looked at Elena with a knowing smile. "So the letter arrived?" Elena blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" Margaret chuckled softly. "Oh, darling, I have my sources. Besides, why else would you have asked for such an urgent meeting?" Elena pulled the letter from her bag and handed it to Margaret. "I got in." Margaret read the letter, her smile widening with each line. "Wonderful. I knew you would do it. I'm so proud of you, Elena." "Thank you, Mrs. Goldstein," Elena replied, blushing slightly. Margaret set the letter on the table and looked at Elena seriously. "Now, I suppose you're worried about the expenses." Elena nodded. "Yes, I don't know how I'll be able to afford it." Margaret waved a hand, dismissing her concern. "Nonsense. Hector and I will take care of everything." "But," Elena began. "No buts," Margaret interrupted. "Elena, you've been like a daughter to us these past 6 years. Let us do this for you." Elena felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know what to say." Margaret took her hand. "You don't have to say anything. Just promise me that you'll make the most of this opportunity." At that moment, Hector Goldstein's voice boomed from the house. "Margaret, where are you?" "In the garden, dear," Margaret called back. Hector appeared, his face lighting up when he saw Elena. "Elena, what a pleasant surprise." He came over and kissed Elena's cheek before sitting down next to his wife. "Well, what's the good news?" Elena looked at Margaret, confused. "You didn't tell him." Hector threw back his head and laughed. "Oh, of course she told me, but I want to hear it from you." Elena smiled. "I got accepted to Columbia. Hector clapped his hands together enthusiastically. Excellent. I knew you would do it. You're brilliant, Elena. Thank you, Mr. Goldstein, Elena replied. I I don't know how to thank you both for everything you've done for me. Hector leaned forward, his face serious. Elena, you don't have to thank us. What we've done, what we will continue to do, is because we believe in you. You have proven time and again that you deserve every opportunity. Margaret nodded in agreement. Besides, Elena, your success is our success. Every child from the orphanage who achieves their dreams is a victory for all of us. Elena felt a wave of emotion. It's just, sometimes I wonder what would have become of me if I hadn't met you that night. Hector and Margaret exchanged a look. It was Hector who spoke. Elena, that night changed many things, not just for you, but for us as well. Margaret continued. You reminded us what's truly important in life. You gave us a purpose beyond accumulating wealth. Hector nodded. The Goldstein Foundation for Underprivileged Children has helped thousands of children in these 6 years, and it all started with you. Elena looked at them both, overwhelmed with emotion. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Hector replied. Just go to New York and conquer the world. Margaret smiled. But first, I think you need to tell the orphanage. Elena suddenly remembered. Oh gosh, Sister Maria, the kids. How will I tell them I'm leaving? Hector stood up. How about we go now? We can break the news together. An hour later, the Goldsteins' luxurious car pulled up in front of the St. Mary's orphanage. While no longer the dilapidated building of 6 years ago, it was still modest compared to the Goldstein mansion. Upon entering, they were greeted by a rush of excited children. Elena! Mr. and Mrs. Goldstein! The children shouted, surrounding them. Sister Maria appeared, smiling broadly. What a pleasant surprise! We weren't expecting you today. Hector stepped forward. Sister Maria, we have some important news to share. The nun looked at them curiously. Please, come into my office. Once in the small office, everyone sat down. Elena, nervous, fiddled with the hem of her blouse. Sister Maria looked at her with concern. Elena, is everything all right? Elena took a deep breath and began. Sister Maria, I received a letter today, a letter from Columbia University. A letter? The nun asked, intrigued. They accepted me, Elena continued. The office fell silent for a moment before Sister Maria jumped out of her chair, tears of joy in her eyes. Oh, Elena, that's wonderful. She hugged Elena tightly. I'm so proud of you, my child. Elena, surprised by this reaction, stammered, But aren't you upset? Because I'm leaving? Sister Maria pulled back, holding Elena by the shoulders. Upset? Elena, this is everything we have ever wanted for you, for all our children, Hector chimed in. Sister Maria, we want you to know that all of Elena's expenses will be taken care of. She won't have to worry about a thing. The nun was thankful. You're very generous, as always. Margaret smiled. It's the least we can do. Elena has been an inspiration to us all. Suddenly, a commotion was heard outside the office. The door flew open and Tommy, now a 14-year-old teenager, burst in. Elena, he asked, his voice a mix of excitement and sadness, is it true you're leaving? Elena stood up, surprised. Tommy, how? Tommy smiled sheepishly. I overheard. Sorry. Sister Maria sighed. I guess the whole orphanage knows now. Hector stood up. Well, how about we make an official announcement? I think this calls for a celebration. Minutes later, all the children and staff of the orphanage were gathered in the dining hall. Elena, nervous, stood in front of everyone, with the Goldsteins and Sister Maria beside her. Kids, Elena began, her voice trembling slightly. I have something important to tell you. A murmur went through the room. Elena continued, I've been accepted to Columbia University in New York. The silence that followed was broken by an explosion of applause and cheers. The younger children ran to hug Elena, while the older ones congratulated her loudly. Tommy approached her, his eyes shining. Elena, does that mean you're leaving? Elena felt a lump in her throat. Yes, Tommy, but I'll be back for the holidays. I promise, Tommy hugged her tightly. I'm going to miss you, but I'm so happy for you. Hector stepped forward, raising his voice to be heard over the commotion. Attention, everyone. I think this calls for a celebration. How about we order pizza for everyone? The children erupted in even louder cheers. Margaret turned to Sister Maria. Sister, why don't you take the children out to the courtyard? Hector and I will take care of ordering the food. As the children rushed out excitedly, Elena lingered, watching the scene with a mixture of joy and nostalgia. Margaret approached her. What are you thinking about, dear? Elena smiled, tears in her eyes. About how much everything has changed. 6 years ago, I would never have imagined this. Hector joined them. Life takes many turns, Elena, and sometimes those turns lead us exactly where we're meant to be. Elena looked at them both. Thank you for everything. I don't know where I'd be without you. Margaret hugged her. Oh, darling, you're the one who has given so much to us. Hector nodded. It's true. You reminded us what's truly important in life. At that moment, Tommy came rushing back. Elena, come on! We're organizing a soccer game in your honor. Elena laughed. In my honor? But I'm terrible at soccer. Tommy took her hand. That's exactly why. It'll be your last chance to improve before you go off to the big city. As Elena was dragged away to the courtyard, the Goldsteins remained, watching with smiles on their faces. Margaret leaned her head on Hector's shoulder. You know, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gone to the orphanage that morning. Hector put his arm around her. I prefer not to think about it. I'm just grateful that I did. You've changed so much, Hector, Margaret said softly. Hector kissed his wife's forehead. We've all changed, dear, and I think for the better. As they watched Elena playing and laughing with the children, they both felt a deep sense of fulfillment. As the impromptu soccer game continued in the courtyard, Hector and Margaret joined Sister Maria on a nearby bench. It's amazing how much she's grown, Sister Maria remarked, watching Elena. Hector nodded. Not just in height, her maturity, her compassion. She's an extraordinary young woman. And to think it all started with a chance encounter on the street. Margaret added, her voice tinged with nostalgia. And to think it all started with that one encounter on the street. Sister Maria looked at them curiously. You've never told me the details of that first meeting. How did it happen exactly? Hector and Margaret exchanged an uncomfortable look. It was Hector who finally spoke. It wasn't our finest moment, sister. In fact, it was probably one of my worst. Hector, Margaret interrupted, but he raised a hand to stop her. No, Margaret. Sister Maria deserves to know the truth. He turned to the nun. You see, sister, I wasn't kind to Elena when I first met her. In fact, I was cruel. Sister Maria looked at him in surprise. Cruel? But you've been so generous with us all these years. Hector sighed deeply. That night, Elena approached me, asking for help, and I turned her away. Worse, I mocked her. Sister Maria remained silent, processing the information. Hector continued, I'm not proud of it. In fact, it's something that has haunted me ever since. But that night, that interaction changed something in me. Margaret took her husband's hand. It was a turning point for both of us. When I learned what happened, I knew we had to do something. Sister Maria looked at them both, her expression softening. Repentance and redemption are powerful, aren't they? Hector nodded. More than I ever imagined. Elena, she gave us a second chance, a chance to be better people. At that moment, a cheer erupted, interrupting the conversation. Elena, to everyone's surprise, including her own, had managed to score a goal. As laughter filled the air, it became evident that the ripple effect of that one encounter had created a wave of change, transforming not only lives but hearts as well. The Goldsteins, once blinded by their fortune, had found a new wealth in compassion and purpose, all thanks to the girl who dared to ask for help and unknowingly set them on a path of redemption. I did it, Elena exclaimed, jumping for joy. I actually did it. The children swarmed around her, celebrating as if she'd won the World Cup. The scene brought smiles to the adults' faces. You know, Sister Maria said, I think Elena gave you more than a second chance. She gave you a purpose. Margaret nodded. You're right. Before Elena, our lives were empty. We had money, success, but we were missing something. We were missing humanity, Hector completed. Elena reminded us what it means to be truly human. As they watched the celebration in the courtyard, Sister Maria mused aloud, "Sometimes angels come in the most unexpected packages. Elena was an angel for you, just like you have been for us." Hector stood up, a new determination on his face. "And we're going to make sure she keeps flying high. Columbia is just the beginning for her." Margaret looked at him curiously. "What are you up to, Hector?" He smiled mysteriously. "You'll see, dear. You'll see." At that moment, Elena came running over, her face beaming with happiness. "Did you see that?" she asked breathlessly. "I scored a goal." Hector hugged her tightly. "We saw, Elena. We're very proud of you, in more ways than one," he added, winking at her. Elena looked at them all, her smile faltering slightly. I'm going to miss all of this. The orphanage, the kids, you, Sister Maria." Sister Maria took her hand. "Elena, dear, this will always be your home, no matter how far you go or how long you're away. You will always have a place here, and with us," Margaret added. "Our house in New York will always be open to you." Elena looked at them in surprise. "You have a house in New York?" Hector smiled. "We will, by the time you start college. We can't let our star pupil be all alone in the big city, can we?" Tears welled up in Elena's eyes. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Hector replied. "Just promise us that you'll give it your all at Columbia and that you won't forget where you came from." Elena nodded, wiping her tears. "I promise. I'll never forget everything you've done for me, for all of us." Just then, the sound of a car horn interrupted the conversation. The pizzas had arrived. "Food!" the children shouted in unison, running for the entrance. Elena laughed. "Some things never change." As they headed inside, Hector paused for a moment, observing the scene before him. The once dilapidated and forgotten orphanage was now brimming with life and joy. The children, once hopeless, now had dreams and aspirations. And at the center of it all was Elena, the girl who had touched his heart of stone and transformed it. "Hector!" Margaret called. "Are you coming?" He smiled, joining his wife. "Yes, dear. Let's go celebrate." As they entered the dining hall, filled with laughter and animated conversations, Hector couldn't help but think about how a small act of kindness, even one born of remorse, could set off a chain of events that would change so many lives. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, stories, and plans for the future. Elena, surrounded by her chosen family, was overwhelmed with gratitude and emotion. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that she had an army of people supporting her. When it was finally time to say goodbye, Elena hugged each of the children, promising to return soon and to write to them regularly. "Don't forget about us when you're famous," Tommy joked. Elena laughed. "Never. You're my family." As the Goldsteins were preparing to leave, Sister Maria hugged Elena one last time. "I'm so proud of you, my child," she whispered. "Go and conquer the world. But remember, you will always have a home here." Elena felt tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "I know, sister. Thank you for everything." In the car on the way home, Elena sat in silence, processing everything that had happened. Margaret looked at her with concern. "Are you all right, dear?" Elena nodded slowly. "Yes, it's just a lot to take in. 6 years ago, I didn't even dream of going to college. And now you have the world at your feet, Elena," Hector interrupted gently. "And you've earned it." "But," Elena continued, "I can't help but think about all the children still at the orphanage. They deserve this opportunity too." Margaret and Hector exchanged a knowing look. "Well," Hector said with a smile, "maybe it's time we expanded our foundation. What would you say if we created a scholarship program for the children at the orphanage?" Elena's eyes lit up. "Really? That would be amazing." Margaret nodded. "And you could help us design it. After all, who better to understand what those children need?" Elena felt her heart swell with emotion. "I'd love to. Thank you." The rest of the journey passed in a comfortable silence. Elena gazed out the window, watching the city she would soon leave behind. But instead of sadness, she felt a mix of excitement and determination. She knew the future ahead was full of possibilities, and she was determined to make the most of them, not just for herself, but for all the children at the orphanage who dreamt of a better tomorrow. As the car drove away, Elena made a silent promise. She would be back, and when she did, she would bring even more hope and opportunities to those who, like her, just needed a chance to shine. The noise of the Big Apple was deafening. Elena, now a 24-year-old woman, walked with a determined stride through the busy streets of Manhattan. Her power suit and leather briefcase contrasted sharply with the image of the timid girl she once was. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Elena Ramirez," she answered in a professional voice. "Elena, where are you?" Margaret Goldstein's voice sounded anxious on the other end of the line. Elena glanced at her watch and cursed under her breath. "I'm so sorry, Margaret. The traffic is horrible. I'll be there in 10 minutes. "Hurry," Margaret urged. "The charity gala is about to start, and you're the guest of honor." I know, Elena replied, quickening her pace. "I'll be there, I promise." She hung up and hurried toward the luxurious hotel where the event was being held. As she entered the lobby, she bumped into a tall, elegant man. "Oh, I'm so sorry, She stopped short, recognizing the man. It was Hector Goldstein. "Elena," Hector said, his voice a mixture of surprise and something else. Nervousness? "You're late." Elena smoothed down her suit, flustered. "I know, I'm sorry. Work got—" Hector raised a hand to stop her. "It doesn't matter. The important thing is that you're here. Come on, everyone's waiting for you." As they walked toward the main ballroom, Elena couldn't help but notice the tension in Hector's shoulders. Something wasn't right. "Hector," she began, "is everything okay? You seem—" "I'm fine," he cut her off abruptly, then softened his tone. "Just, nervous about the speech." Elena was unconvinced. In the 6 years she had been working for the Goldstein Foundation, she had never seen Hector nervous about a speech. Upon entering the ballroom, they were greeted by a sea of applause. Margaret rushed over, her smile bright, contrasting with Hector's tense expression. "Elena, darling," Margaret exclaimed, embracing her. "You look beautiful. Come, there's someone I want you to meet." Before Elena could respond, Margaret whisked her away through the crowd. Hector trailed behind them, his eyes nervously scanning the room. "Elena," Margaret said, stopping in front of a middle-aged man, "this is Robert Callahan, our new partner in the Foundation's expansion project." The man extended his hand, a smile playing on his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "A pleasure, Miss Ramirez. I've heard a lot about you." Elena shook his hand, feeling an inexplicable chill. "The pleasure is all mine, Mr. Callahan." At that moment, an aide approached Hector. "Mr. Goldstein, it's time for your speech." Hector nodded, his face pale. "Thank you. Elena, could you accompany me to the podium?" Confused, Elena followed him. As they climbed the stage, Hector leaned toward her. "Elena," he whispered, his voice shaky, "no matter what happens, remember that everything we've done has been for the good of the Foundation." Before Elena could ask what he meant, Hector stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming through the hall, "thank you for joining us tonight. As you know, we're here to celebrate the 6th anniversary of the Goldstein Foundation for Underprivileged Children." Applause filled the room. Hector continued, "In these 6 years, we have accomplished incredible things. We have helped thousands of children. We have built schools. We have created scholarship programs. And none of this would have been possible without the support of all of you." He paused, his gaze meeting Elena's. "But tonight, we are not here just to celebrate the past. We are here to announce the future, a future that I'm afraid will bring significant changes." A murmur rippled through the audience. Elena felt her heart quicken. "After much deliberation," Hector continued, "I have decided that it is time for me to step down. Effective tomorrow, I will be resigning from my position as CEO of Goldstein Enterprises and president of the foundation." The room erupted in gasps of surprise. Elena felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "I know this comes as a shock to many," Hector said, raising his voice above the commotion. "But I firmly believe that this is what's best for the future of the foundation. And that's why I am pleased to announce that my successor will be none other than Robert Callahan." Elena turned sharply to Hector, unable to believe what she was hearing. Robert Callahan? The man she had just met? "Mr. Callahan," Hector continued, "brings with him a wealth of experience in the business world and philanthropy. I am confident that under his leadership, the foundation will reach new heights. As the audience applauded politely, Elena noticed that Margaret seemed just as surprised as she was. Something didn't add up. Hector turned to Elena, his face a mask of contained emotions. And now I would like to invite to the stage the person who inspired all of this, Elena Ramirez. Please, Elena, say a few words. Elena approached the microphone, her mind a whirlwind of questions. What was going on? Why hadn't Hector told her any of this? Good evening, everyone, she began, her voice trembling slightly. As many of you know, my story with the Goldstein Foundation. She paused, her eyes meeting Hector's, a silent plea for answers in her gaze. As the weight of the situation settled upon her, Elena realized this was more than just a celebration. It was a turning point, a shift in the very foundation she had come to rely on. My story with the Goldstein Foundation, Elena began, her voice trembling slightly, started 12 years ago, when I was just a girl in an orphanage. She paused, searching for the right words. In all these years, I've witnessed firsthand the impact this foundation has had on the lives of countless children. And all of that has been thanks to the leadership and vision of Victor and Margaret Goldstein. She turned to Victor, her eyes searching for answers. Victor, I don't know what to say. This announcement is unexpected, but I want you to know that no matter what the future holds, your legacy will live on in every life you have touched. Victor nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Elena continued, to all of you, I ask that you continue to support this cause. The children need us now more than ever. Thank you. Applause filled the room as Elena stepped off the stage. Margaret immediately intercepted her. Elena, darling, she whispered, her voice tense. We need to talk. In private. Before they could move, Robert Callahan approached them, his smile still in place. Wonderful speech, Miss Ramirez, he said, his voice smooth as silk. I hope we can work together in the future. Elena forced a smile. Of course, Mr. Callahan. If you'll excuse me, I have to. Oh, please, call me Robert, he interrupted. After all, we're practically family now. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Before she could respond, Margaret took her arm. I'm sorry, Robert, Margaret said with a strained smile, but I need to steal Elena for a moment. Without waiting for a reply, she dragged Elena out of the ballroom and into an empty room. Margaret, Elena began once they were alone. What's going on? Why didn't Victor tell us any of this? Margaret sank into a chair, her face a mask of worry. I don't know, Elena. I'm just as surprised as you are. Victor has been acting strange lately, but I never thought he would do something like this. Elena began to pace the room. And who is this Robert Callahan, really? Where did he come from? Margaret shook her head. I met him a few weeks ago. Victor introduced him as a potential investor for the foundation. But this is completely unexpected. At that moment, the door opened and Victor entered, closing it quickly behind him. Victor, Margaret began, rising to her feet. What the hell is going on? Victor raised his hands in a placating gesture. I know. I should have told you sooner, but what? Elena interrupted, her voice shaking with emotion. Victor, you've worked your whole life for this foundation. Why hand it over to a stranger? Victor slumped into a chair, suddenly seeming years older. I didn't have a choice, Elena. Callahan, he has information that could destroy everything. Margaret went to her husband, taking his hand. Victor, what are you talking about? Victor took a deep breath before continuing. Years ago, before I met Elena, before the foundation, I did things, Margaret. Things I'm not proud of. Shady business deals, tax evasion. Elena felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. I thought I had buried that past, Victor continued, his voice cracking. But Callahan found out. He threatened to expose everything if I didn't hand over control of the foundation to him. Margaret dropped Victor's hand and stepped back. Why didn't you tell me? We could have figured something out together. Victor shook his head. I didn't want to involve you, Margaret, and I thought I could handle it on my own. Elena, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. Victor, do you realize what you've done? You've put everything we've worked for at risk. Victor looked at her, his eyes filled with remorse. I know, Elena, and I'm sorry. I I thought I was protecting the foundation, but now I see that I've only put it in greater danger. Elena went to the window, looking out at the city stretching beyond. What are we going to do now? Margaret, regaining her composure, stood up. Fight! We can't let Callahan get away with this. Victor looked at her, surprised. But Margaret, if we fight him, everything will come out. The foundation, our reputation. It's not about our reputation anymore, Victor, Margaret replied firmly. It's about the children who depend on us. We can't let them down. Elena turned to them, a new determination on her face. Margaret's right. We've come too far to give up now. Victor looked at them both, a spark of hope flickering in his eyes. Are you sure? If we do this, there's no turning back. Elena nodded. I'm sure. This foundation, it gave me a second chance at life. It's time I did the same for it. Margaret took her husband's hand. We're in this together, Victor, no matter what. Victor stood up, his posture straighter than it had been all night. All right then, what's the plan? Elena smiled, an idea forming in her mind. I think I have an idea, but we're going to need some help. Just then, a knock on the door startled them. Robert Callahan's voice could be heard from the other side. Victor, are you in there? The press wants to ask a few questions about the change in leadership. The three of them looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. It was time to act. Victor cleared his throat before answering. One moment, Robert. We'll be right there. He turned to Elena and Margaret. Ready for this? Elena nodded, her determination unwavering. More than ever. It's time to show Callahan that you don't mess with the Goldstein family. Margaret smiled, a spark of her old fierceness returning to her eyes. Game on. With a final exchange of glances, the three of them headed for the door, ready to face whatever fate had in store for them. The night was far from over, and the real battle had just begun. Opening the door, they came face to face with Robert Callahan, whose confident smile faltered momentarily at the sight of their determined expressions. Ah, there you are, he said, quickly regaining his composure. The press is eager for a few statements. Of course, Robert, Victor stepped forward. But first, there's something we need to discuss. In private. Callahan frowned. Now? The press is waiting. Elena stepped in, her voice firm but courteous. Trust me, Mr. Callahan. This can't wait. With some reluctance, Callahan followed them back to the room. Once inside, Victor closed the door and turned to him. Robert, he began, I think we've made a mistake. Callahan raised an eyebrow. A mistake, Victor? We've already discussed this. The deal is done. Margaret stepped forward. A deal based on blackmail is no deal, Robert. Callahan's smile vanished. Careful what you say, Margaret. Remember what's at stake. Elena, who had been observing silently, spoke. You mean Victor's shady business dealings? The tax evasion? Callahan turned to her, surprised. I see you're all caught up. Then you'll understand why it's best that you cooperate. Victor shook his head. No, Robert, it's over. I'm not handing the foundation over to you. Callahan's expression hardened. You realize what you're doing, Victor? With one phone call, I can destroy everything you've worked for. Elena stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. And you realize what you're doing, Mr. Callahan? You're threatening an organization that helps thousands of children in need. Callahan scoffed. Business is business, Miss Ramirez. I don't expect an orphan-turned-executive to understand that. The comment made Elena stiffen, but she kept her composure. Maybe it's precisely because I was an orphan that I understand the importance of this foundation better than you do. Robert, Margaret intervened, we can still work this out amicably. Tell us, what do you really want? Callahan looked at each of them before answering. What I want is simple, complete control of the foundation and of Goldstein Enterprises. With Victor's contacts and reputation, I can expand my business in ways you can't even imagine. Victor shook his head. You're crazy if you think I'm going to hand over everything I've worked for. Callahan smiled coldly. You'd rather see it all destroyed? Because that's the alternative, Victor. Elena, who had been thinking furiously, had an idea. Mr. Callahan, what if we could offer you something better than control of the foundation? Everyone turned to her, surprised. Callahan looked at her curiously. I'm listening. Elena took a deep breath before continuing. You mentioned expanding your business. How about a partnership with some of the most influential companies in the country? Callahan narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? Elena smiled. In the last 6 years, I've built a rather impressive network of contacts. CEOs, politicians, philanthropists, people who trust me and my judgment. Victor and Margaret stared at her with a mixture of surprise and pride. I could arrange meetings for you with them. Open doors you didn't even know existed. All legally, all above board. Callahan seemed intrigued. Interesting, but why would you do that for me? I'm not doing it for you, Elena replied firmly. I'm doing it for the foundation and for the children who depend on it. Elena, Victor said, you don't have to do this. She smiled at him. Yes, I do. You gave me a chance when I needed it most. It's time I returned the favor. Callahan watched them for a moment before speaking. Let's say I agree. What guarantee do I have that you'll hold up your end of the bargain? You have our word, Margaret replied. And trust me, Robert, a Goldstein's word is worth more than any contract. Callahan seemed to consider the offer for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. All right, I'm willing to consider this alternative, but I want to see concrete results before I hand over the information I have. Fair enough, Elena nodded. I'll give you a list of names and contacts tomorrow morning. Arrange the meetings and you'll see that I keep my word. Victor extended his hand to Callahan. Then we have a deal. Callahan stared at the offered hand for a moment before taking it. Deal, but I'm warning you, if this is a trick. It's not, Elena cut in. We may have gotten off on the wrong foot, Mr. Callahan, but I think we all want the same thing here. Success and stability. Callahan nodded slowly. As they left the room to face the waiting press, a wave of relief washed over them, but they knew it was only the first step in a long and difficult journey. Elena, however, felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced down a blackmailer, not with threats or intimidation, but with a strategic mind and an unwavering commitment to the foundation that had given her so much. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in power or wealth, but in the unwavering belief in a cause and the courage to fight for it, no matter the odds. All right, Miss Ramirez, I'll be expecting that list, Callahan said, and with that, he left the room, leaving the three of them alone once more. Victor turned to Elena, his face a mixture of admiration and worry. Elena, are you sure about this? You're putting a lot on the line. Elena smiled. I'm sure. Besides, what's life without a little risk? Margaret hugged her tightly. You're incredible, you know that. You've grown into an extraordinary woman. Elena returned the embrace. I had good teachers. Victor joined the hug. Thank you, Elena, for everything. When they separated, Elena looked at them both with determination. Now we have work to do. There's a foundation to save. 3 months later, Elena found herself once again on the stage of a charity gala, but this time, the atmosphere was completely different. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice filled with excitement, I'm pleased to announce that the Goldstein Foundation has not only weathered the recent crisis, but has emerged stronger than ever. Applause filled the room. Thanks to a series of new strategic alliances, Elena continued, we have expanded our reach and resources, and all of this would not have been possible without the unexpected collaboration of Mr. Robert Callahan. Callahan, sitting in the front row, nodded with a genuine smile. The meetings Elena had arranged had resulted in business opportunities that far exceeded his original expectations. Furthermore, Elena went on, I'm proud to inform you that Hector Goldstein has been fully exonerated of any past wrongdoing, thanks to his voluntary cooperation with the authorities and his unwavering commitment to transparency. Victor and Margaret, standing beside the stage, held hands, their eyes shining with pride and relief. But most importantly, Elena concluded, thanks to these changes, we will be able to help more children than ever before. The future is bright, not just for the Goldstein Foundation, but for all the children who depend on us. As the audience rose for a standing ovation, Elena stepped off the stage and was met by the embraces of Victor and Margaret. We did it, Victor whispered, tears in his eyes. Elena smiled, looking at the family she had found and the lives they had touched. Yes, she replied. We did it. Together. And as the celebration continued around her, Elena knew that this was not the end of her story, but the beginning of a new and exciting chapter.